What's up, everyone, and welcome back to the channel as we have been dissecting and unpacking Deuteronomy chapter 28 over these last several videos. I guess we began and we were looking at Deuteronomy chapter 28. We looked at verses 1 through 14 and we read all of the blessings that God would bestow upon his people if they were faithful. And we began to unpack verses 29, 15 through 68, but more specifically beginning in verse 29. And we began to unpack these curses that God said would come upon his people if they were not faithful to what he'd called for them to do. And so we ended in our last video looking at Deuteronomy chapter 28, and we really unpacked a lot in that video. We looked at verses 48 through 62, 48 through 62, and we talked about how God said that a nation, verse 49, a nation would come against his people from afar and from the end of the earth as swift as the eagle flies. And we talked about how that nation represents America. We looked at verse 48 and we learned how that yoke of iron, when you Google a yoke of iron, we only see representations of ourselves, of our people, with the yoke of iron around their necks. We looked at verse 53 and we saw how um, the text says that you shall eat the fruit of your own body. And we saw that in the slave ship, the Aragante, and we learned that there were European cannibals who would basically, literally, kill slaves, cut up their bodies, and eat them and serve them to the slaves. If you did not catch that, I would appeal to you to go back to our last video in episode 23, and we ended with verses 60 and 61 and 62, where we talked about how in the it says that also every sickness and every plague which is not written in this book of the law, which will the Lord bring upon you until you are destroyed. And we talked about how uh, we lead in this country, people of color, African Americans, black folk. We lead in basically every category: high blood pressure, COPD, diabetes, you name it, we lead in it. And so God said that He would put upon us all of these diseases, these sicknesses that are not written in the book of law or in the scriptures. And verse 62 talked about how we will be left few in number. And so, even though there will be many of us who would get on these slave ships, there are also many of us who did not make it across the transatlantic. And so, we are picking up in this particular video in verse 63 in Deuteronomy 28, verse 63, where it says, "And it shall be that just as the Lord rejoiced over you to do you good and multiply you, so the Lord will rejoice over you to destroy you and bring you to nothing, and you shall be plucked from off the land which you go to possess." And so he says, because of uh, our sinfulness, because we broke the covenant, he would send upon us. He would, instead of rejoicing over us to do good and multiplying us, he will rejoice over us to destroy us, bring us down to nothing. And if we look at the state of Black America today, that's exactly what we see. We are coming down to nothing. And it says, "You shall be plucked off the land which you go to possess." And we know that our ancestors were plucked off of that land. And then in verse 64, it says something interesting. It says, "Then the Lord will scatter you among all peoples." Scatter you among all peoples. Now, this text is interesting because we see this theme being played out throughout Scripture. Throughout Scripture, we see this over and over again. Let me give you some examples. We looked in Genesis 15 and verse 13. Let's turn there. Genesis 15 and verse 13. We unpacked Genesis 15 and verse 13 in an earlier video, and we learned that Genesis 15 and verse 13, when Abram has this vision, he was not talking about the children of Israel during that time. He was talking about us. In Genesis 15:13, it says, "Then he said to Abram, know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years." And so they would go off into these other lands. Let's turn to Jeremiah chapter 9. Jeremiah chapter 9, and we're going to look at verse 16. Jeremiah chapter 9 and verse 16 says, "I will scatter them also among the Gentiles." And we learned before who the Gentiles are. Jeremiah 9:16. "I will scatter them also among the Gentiles, whom neither they nor their fathers have known." So this would be a people who the children of Israel, who God's people, would not know. And so we learned before when we were looking at Deuteronomy 28, we learned before when we were looking at verse 49, when it talks about a people that they would not know, it could not have been um, Egypt, because they had been in Egypt for 215 years, so it could not have been Egypt. So they would have known those people. Of course, they would have gone back and forth to Egypt. It would not have been Babylon or Syria, because those were nations that were not that far from where they were. And so here in Jeremiah 9:16, "I will scatter them also among the Gentiles." And we learned in a previous lesson that the Gentiles are those who are descendants of Japheth, those who are Europeans. And so at no time in history has, in biblical history, no time in history have the children of Israel been scattered among the Gentiles, among the Europeans, which means that Jeremiah 9:16 cannot be referring to them. Let's continue on. Jeremiah 17, verse 4. Jeremiah 17 and verse 4 says, "And you even yourself shall let go of your heritage, which I gave you." In other words, you will lose your heritage. You will lose who you are. You will forget who you are, which is exactly where we are today. We don't know who we are. We have forgotten who we are. I wouldn't even say, to be honest, that we have forgotten. We just don't know who we are. The reality is we just don't know who we are. And so we can't even forget something that for many of us, we don't even know. It says, "And I will cause you to serve your enemies in the land which you do not know." So here we see the same theme. I'm going to scatter you, I'm going to cause you to serve your enemies in a land that you do not know, that you do not know. He keeps repeating the same thing. "For you have kindled a fire in my anger, which shall burn forever, which shall burn forever." Let's look at Jeremiah chapter 5. Jeremiah chapter 5 and verse 19. Jeremiah chapter 5 and verse 19. "And it will be when you say, why does the Lord our God do all these things to us? Then you shall answer them, just as you have forsaken me and served foreign gods in your land, so you shall serve aliens, strangers in a land that is not yours." Okay, so I'm going to take you, I'm going to scatter you, and you're going to serve foreign gods in a land that is not yours. And we're going to unpack that more in a moment, because Deuteronomy 28 and verse 64 is going to elaborate on that even more. You're going to serve these gods in a land that is not yours. Same thing. Zechariah chapter 7. Zechariah chapter 7 and verse 14. Zechariah chapter 7 and verse 14. And so we're seeing this thing being played out over and over again. Zechariah chapter 7 and verse 14. "But I scattered them with a whirlwind among all the nations which they had not known." It's interesting because he continues to say the same thing. I'm scattering them among these nations that they have not known. So they didn't know America, they didn't know Europe, they didn't know Jamaica, they didn't know the Caribbean, they didn't know any of these places. All of these places that we would be scattered, we did not know. We did not know any of these places. But this is what the text says. Let's look at Ezekiel chapter 20. Ezekiel chapter 20 and verse 23. Why does he continue to say over and over again that I'm going to scatter you? I'm going to scatter you. I'm going to scatter you. Ezekiel chapter 20 and verse 23. Also, I raised my hand in an oath to those in the wilderness that I would scatter them among the Gentiles and disperse them throughout the countries. Hmm. Same thing. Same thing. That God would scatter his people. God would scatter his people. Jeremiah, let me give you one more. Jeremiah 16, verse 13. Jeremiah 16, verse 13 says, Therefore I will cast you out of this land into a land that you do not know, neither you nor your fathers, and there you shall serve other gods day and night, where I will not show you favor. You will serve other gods day and night. Now let's go back to Deuteronomy chapter 28. Let's go back to Deuteronomy 28. We're going to go back in verse 64 where we left off. Deuteronomy 28 and verse 64 where we left off. Then the Lord will scatter you among all peoples from one end of the earth to the other. So that's clear. So it cannot be Babylon, Egypt, or Assyria, because it says one from one end of the earth to the other. From one end of the earth to the other. So that's clear that it could not be any of those three. Once again, any of those three nations. It says, and there you shall serve other gods which neither you nor your fathers have known, wood and stone. So you go. So this is what we've been seeing in these other texts. You'll be scattered among these nations, and you will serve other gods. You will serve other gods. Now, what are those other gods? um we talked about this in a previous lesson. You serve the sorority, these fraternities and sororities that we become members of, serving other gods. Okay. Serving white Jesus, that's another god. That's another god. Serving ourselves, that's a god. That's a god. Serving these political parties, we would go into these nations, we would be scattered into these nations, and we would serve all of these other gods that us nor our fathers have ever known. It continues. And among those nations you shall find no rest, nor shall the sole of your feet have a resting place. But there the Lord will give you a trembling heart, failing eyes, and anguish of soul. So you'll be scattered to these nations, and you will find no rest. Every time you think you're at peace, something else comes up. Every time, and we're going to look at this in the next verse. When you look in the rear view mirror, when you see those blue lights, you have no rest, no peace. You won't know if you're going to have a job tomorrow. You won't know if the police going to bust your door down and shoot you in the back. All of these things that have happened to us. You won't know if I'm just driving down the street and I get pulled over for no reason and I may not make it home. Every single time we see those blue lights in our rear view. I mean, let's be honest. There's no rest. There's no rest because we don't know if we're going to make it home that evening. That's how bad it is in this country for people of color. It says, and among those nations you shall find no rest, nor shall the sole of your feet have a resting place. But there the Lord will give you a trembling heart, failing eyes, and anguish of soul. Your life shall hang in doubt before you. You shall fear day and night and have no assurance of life. Your life shall hang in doubt before you. It is amazing how, I was talking about how, I send my children to school every day, and every morning I have to pray. I have to pray that they make it home safely. I have to pray that they make it home safely. Number one, because of this environment that we live in, because of this country that we live in, because people are quick to go shoot up a school for no reason. And so I have to pray every morning that my children make it home. because of the environment that we live in. And of course, as parents, we have to give our children the talk. We have to give them the talk when they are out, if they're driving, if they're doing whatever, because we want to make sure that they make it home in one piece. Because, as the text says, uh, our lives hang in doubt. We fear day and night and have no assurance of life. There's no assurance that our children are going to make it home every day. There's no assurance that we are going to make it home alive every day. It says in verse 67, in the morning you shall say, oh, that it were evening. And at evening you shall say, oh, that it were morning, because of the fear which terrifies your heart, and because of the sight which your eyes see. Because of the fear which terrifies your heart. It says, in the morning you shall say, oh, that it were evening. And at evening you shall say, oh, that it were morning. Because of the fear, because of what you see, because of everything that happens before you. And then verse 68 is probably this thing is just, if there's any doubt, verse 68 has to remove all doubt. And this is why I say a lot of our European brethren, they don't touch Deuteronomy 28 because they can't explain this. And the Lord will take you back to Egypt in ships by the way of which I said to you, you shall never see it again. And there you shall be offered for sale to your enemies as male and female slaves, but no one will buy you or no one will redeem you. You shall be taken back to Egypt in ships. What does it mean you'll be taken back to Egypt? All right. Well, if you go to, I believe it's, what is it? Exodus chapter 30. Let's see. I think I want Exodus chapter 30. Exodus chapter 30. Exodus chapter 13. I'm sorry. Exodus chapter 13, I believe is what I want. Exodus chapter 13 and verse 3 says, and Moses said to the people, remember this day in which you went out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. For by strength of hand the Lord brought you out of this place. So Egypt represents bondage. So in Deuteronomy chapter 28 and verse 68, where it mentions, and the Lord would take you back to Egypt in ships. Now, this is the thing. First of all, we have to understand this. Egypt represents bondage. Okay. And so, what would be our Egypt? That's a good question. That's a good question. What would be our Egypt? Well, if we want to think about our Egypt and being taken back in ships, let's think about this. Let's see. Let me pull up my screen so you can see. Uh, let's think about the. Uh, I'm sure many of you have seen this before. Let's see. You have this thing called the Washington Monument, which is literally it is an Egyptian obelisk. All right, Egyptian obelisk, the Washington Monument. Hmm. Okay. Let's try something else. Let's pull up something else. Anybody ever heard of the Luxor Hotel? The Luxor Hotel. We're talking about Egypt. All right, America representing Egypt, or America representing bondage. All right, so let me pull up an. Anybody ever seen this is the Luxor Hotel in Las Vegas. All right, talking about Egypt. Talking about Egypt. All right, talking about Egypt. Egyptian bondage. All right, let's look at the Scottish Rite House of the Temple. Talking about Egypt, this Masonic temple. All right. All of this is Egyptian imagery. All of this is Egyptian imagery. All right. Let's look at the back. I'm sure many of y'all got money. Let's look at the back of the dollar bill. What is that? An Egyptian pyramid. An Egyptian pyramid. All right. What else do we have? What else do we have? Do you know that there is an Alexandria, Virginia, and then there is an Alexandria, Egypt. Hmm, interesting. All right. Did you know that there's a Cairo, Egypt, and a Cairo in America? Let's see. Cairo. It's a city in Illinois. Interesting. All right. Then you have a Memphis, Tennessee. I'm sure many of you have heard of Memphis, Tennessee. You have Memphis, Egypt. Memphis, Egypt. All right. And this one takes the cake. You have the Nile River. You all have heard of that before. But then you also have the Nile of North America. The Nile of North America is often referred to as the Colorado River. And so we see all of these examples of America being Egypt. America being Egypt. And the text says, and the Lord will take you back to Egypt in ships. The Lord will take you back to Egypt in ships. Now, this is the interesting thing. This is the interesting thing. Now, if you've ever seen a map, let me pull up a map for you so you can see what I'm talking about. All right. Let's say map of uh, Egypt and Israel. Let's see. So let me pull up a map for you so you can see here exactly what we're referring to. So if you don't know your basic geography, so let's see here. You have Egypt. Oh, that's not. All right, there we go. As you can see, you have Egypt here, and you have Israel that is literally right next door to it. All right, right next door to Egypt. And so the text says, and the Lord will take you back to Egypt in ships. Now, this is the thing. At no time in history, did the children of Israel go to Egypt or from Egypt to Israel in ships. At no time in history. They always walked. They always walked. And so you have to ask yourself, as a matter of fact, not only did they all only walk, and so with the the million or so, however many Israelites were in Israel at the time, what we today call Israel, with however many people were there, um, in order to go to Egypt in ships, they would have to have massive cruise ships. Now, they didn't have cruise ships back then, but let's say they had a cruise ship, right, that would hold 2,000 people. How many trips would they have to make in order to, get everybody from Jerusalem to Egypt in a ship? Go from Jerusalem to Egypt in a ship. I mean, it doesn't even make sense. Doesn't make sense. And so we know that verse 68, Deuteronomy chapter 28 and verse 68 is not referring to them going, to the children of Israel going from Jerusalem to Egypt. It's not referring to them. It's not referring to that situation. It's referring to when our brothers and sisters, when our ancestors were taken from the continent of Africa, from the west coast of Africa, from the slave coast, when they were taken from that coast and brought to this country, brought to not just this country, but in the Caribbean as well. That's what it's referring to. When we were brought to this country, and the Lord will take you back to bondage, to Egypt, to bondage in ships, by the way of which I said to you, you shall never see it again. And there you shall be offered for sale to your enemies as male and female slaves, but no one will buy you, or no one, in other words, no one will redeem you. No one will release you. All right. No one will redeem you. No one will save you. No one will rescue you from that. And so Deuteronomy 28 is speaking specifically about us. And so why is that important? It's important because when we look at the state of quote unquote Black America, when we think about what we are experiencing in this country, us voting somebody else in is not going to change it. Us attempting to change some law, that's not going to change prophecy. The reason why we continue to experience all of the things that we experience, all of this stuff that we've talked about over these last several days of Deuteronomy 28, all of this stuff is happening to us today. And all of us watching, we can acknowledge that these things are happening, but nothing has changed. Throughout the 400 years that we have been in this country, nothing has changed. Why has nothing changed? Because we have not been turning back to God. We've not turned back to God. Prophecy has to be fulfilled. And listen, I had a conversation with an individual. Now listen, it's quote unquote Black History Month, and I fully believe that we should celebrate our pioneers who got us this far. Those, the Malcolm X's and the Martin Luther Kings and the Sojourner Truths and the Rosa Parks and all of these individuals. I believe that. Okay. But the problem is this: every Black History Month, we always talk about these individuals, and we talk about individuals, or we talk about situations that have happened from 1619 moving forward. But even when we are made aware, and we've been made aware of these individuals and their contributions and what they've done for us and all of these other things for how many years? And it has not changed our mindset. It has not changed how we live. It has not changed how we carry ourselves. It's not changed at all. But what would happen? What would happen if we actually, instead of focusing specifically just on them, we actually focused on and looked at who we are and here, Black history from this thing right here. And we got to understand who we are, who God has created for us to be. What would happen if we understood that when we look at scripture, we are kings and we are queens and we are priests and we are the chosen of God? What would happen if we looked at it from that mindset? How would things change? How would things change? Do you think that many of our young Black males and young Black females who want nothing to do with God and religion and all of these other things, do you think that maybe in Christianity, do you think that maybe if they saw themselves, if they knew that they were in this, okay, do you think that maybe it may change their mindset? Maybe it would cause them to look at their brother or their sister differently, because they would look at their brother and their sister and they would see them as a fellow Hebrew Israelite, a fellow child of God. Would it change? I think it would. I think it would. I mentioned in a previous video that when I became aware of this, now I was not one who was quick to condemn my brothers and sisters in the past anyway. But after learning what I know now, it has caused me to look at all of my brothers and sisters differently, all of them. Because I understand that the reason why we are doing the things that we're doing is not just because we are just, we hate our brother or our sister. It's because we don't know who we are, and we are literally fulfilling Bible prophecy. And so it's my responsibility and our responsibility, those of us who know who we are, to point our people back to this and let them know who they are, and let them know that, and this is what we're going to begin talking about in our next video, what is necessary, what is needed for things to get better. As I said before, are things going to get better for us collectively as a whole? No. No, because prophecy has to be fulfilled. But can a lot of us, a whole lot of us, change the trajectory of our lives, of our environment, of what we're going through? Yes, it can happen. But it can only happen if we turn back to him. But you won't feel the need to turn back to him if you don't know that this is referring to you, that Deuteronomy 28 is referring to you, and that according to scripture, the only way for you to get out of it is to turn back to him. That's the only way. And so we're going to close this video, this particular video. And I hope that this resonates with somebody. I hope it resonates with somebody. You know, this is why I have a you know, I feel a passion to talk about this stuff, because, you know, oftentimes we find one end of the spectrum or another. You find those who are, you know, my brothers in the Black Hebrew Israelite movement, and they are, you know, gung-ho about, listen, we are the people of God, and, you know, there are many of them who don't believe that anybody's outside of us are going to be saved, which is not, you know, according to scripture. That's contrary to scripture. So you have those on that end, but then you have those on the quote unquote Christianity end who don't feel like any of this is important. Any of this is important. And so they discount it. They throw the baby out with the bathwater. You find very, very, very few people who are in the middle, who recognize that, okay, our heritage is important, who we are in scripture is important, but it doesn't negate the fact that, okay, I can still be a Christian, quote unquote. So for me, I can recognize that according to the Bible, because I am a descendant of Shem, I did my DNA, African ancestry DNA, and I am an Igbo. All right. We talked about this in a previous video about who the Igbos are. But because I am a descendant of Shem, all right, which means I'm a descendant of Abraham. Abraham, according to Genesis 14:13, was the first one who was called a Hebrew, and Shem's grandson, Eber, is a derivative, or where we get the word Hebrew from. All right, and so because of that, I can recognize that because Shem is the father of the Hebrews, I can acknowledge that, yes, I am a Hebrew. I am a Hebrew. My ethnicity is not black. It's not white. It's not African American. My ethnicity is a Hebrew. All right. My religion, because remember, ethnicity and religion are two separate things. So my ethnicity is Hebrew, but my religion is Christianity. And for my brothers and sisters who are watching, who are the Hebrew Israelites, whatever, I already know that you know the Christianity, you know, has been distorted and all of this other stuff, whatever. But me, I have the blessing of being a pastor. And so because I have the blessing of being a pastor, I don't have to absorb and teach all of the false teachings, the false doctrines that are in Christianity. I can teach what it looked like when it was being preached and teached and lived and everything in biblical times. And so, but as I was saying, there you don't find a lot of people who are in the middle. You find them, they're either on one end of the spectrum or another. Either this stuff doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what color Jesus was. All right. Doesn't matter that any of these people in the Bible were people of color. Not recognizing that we are the only ones who worship a God that doesn't look like us. Not recognizing that when we worship a God, or subconsciously worship a God that looks like a European, that is basically that is supporting supporting white supremacy. And so the reason why we can, I mean, if you see a European, a white individual as God, then you're naturally going to see yourself as less than. That's just natural. You're going to see yourself as less than. And so you have individuals on the Christianity side who believe that this stuff doesn't matter. Okay? This stuff doesn't matter. But then you got the folk on the Hebrew Israelites, the black Hebrew Israelite side, who believe that, okay, this is all that matters. Okay? All that matters. And so because I'm a person of color, because I'm melanated, I'm going to be saved. All right? And if I'm not melanated, I can't be saved. But that, and as I said before, that's contrary to scripture. But anyway, uh, if you have, I mean, I hope that you have gotten something out of this message and out of our previous messages. If you have not done so, if you're watching this on YouTube, please like, subscribe, comment. What does this mean to you? And how is this going to affect you? Will it affect you moving forward? Thank you so